Welcome to Melrose Unitarian Universalist Church. We gather this morning to celebrate a long, rich, and full life. I light our chalice, the symbol of our living faith, this morning in honor of Margaret Ann Reamer Grometstein, a member of this congregation for more than 60 years. On behalf of Margaret's family, I welcome you all here today. Thank you for the gifts of memory that you bring. Today's service elements were chosen by Margaret's family, her son-in-law John and her daughter Randall, themselves very long-term members of this congregation. The photo montage you just watched was made by Nelson, Margaret's son-in-law. Our hymns were selected to reflect Margaret's Methodist upbringing, and our choir, all friends of Randall and John, have a special song that they will share later on in the service. I will give a brief eulogy, and then I will invite first Margaret's family to come forward and to share from the lectern, and then after that we will have a time of open sharing where all of Margaret's friends are welcome to come and share a memory or a wish for the family. Thank you all for helping us to create this memorial service as an act of love. All are welcome to join us afterward for a reception in Parish Hall. For our opening words this morning, I have chosen a short passage from the great British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Those who live nobly, if in their day live obscurely, need not fear that they have lived in vain. Something radiates from their lives, some light that shows the way. to their friends, their neighbors, perhaps to long future ages. The individual, if she is filled with love, with courage, and with endurance, can do a great deal. Please now, if you would, stand in body or in spirit and join for the opening hymn, number 20 in the gray hymnal, Be Thou My Vision. The words will appear up here on the screen, or you may follow along in the hymnal. Please be seated. And now I call forward Margaret's granddaughter, Sarah Lancaster. She will share a poem chosen for this day by Margaret's family. Sarah, if you would come up to the lectern. The poem is called Starfish by Eleanor Lerman.
This is what life does. It lets you walk up to the store to buy breakfast in the paper on a stiff knee. It lets you choose the way you have your eggs, your coffee. Then it sits a fisherman down beside you at the counter who says, "Last night the channel was full of starfish." And you wonder, is this a message, finally? Or just another day? Life lets you take the dog for a walk down to the pond, where whole generations of biological processes are boiling beneath the mud. Reeds speak to you of the natural world. They whisper, they sing, and herons pass by. Are you old enough to appreciate the moment? Too old? There is movement beneath the water, but it may be nothing. There may be nothing going on. And then life suggests that you remember the years you ran around, the years you developed a shocking lifestyle, advocated careless abandon, owned a chilly heart. Upon reflection, you are genuinely surprised to find how quiet you have become. And then life lets you go home to think about all this, which you do for quite a long time. Later, you wake up beside your old love, the one who never had any conditions, the one who waited you out. This is life's way of letting you know that you are lucky. It won't give you smart or brave, so you'll have to settle for lucky. Because you were born at a good time, because you were able to listen when people spoke to you, because you stopped when you should have and started again. So life lets you have a sandwich and pie for your late night dessert, pie for the dog as well. And then life sends you back to bed, to dreamland, while outside the starfish drift through the channel with smiles on their starry faces as they head out to deep water, to the far and boundless sea.
Margaret Ann Reamer was born April 17, 1927, in Springdale, Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh. She was the second of Charles and Grace Reamer's 5 children. When Margaret was just 9 years old, her father died, and it turned her life upside down. It was in the midst of the Great Depression, and Grace, Margaret's mother, struggled to support the family. In the end, she had to give up her youngest son for adoption, and she sent Margaret away for high school. Margaret went to live with and keep house for 2 women she would later call aunt in Mamaroneck, New York. It was there that Margaret heard about the Cornell University New York Hospital School of Nursing, which she was later proud to attend and graduate from. It was during her time in nursing school, in 1949 to be exact, that Margaret met by chance her lifelong love, Alan Grometstein. Alan's best friend, Eric, was dating a friend of Margaret's, and so Alan asked him to ask his girlfriend to find somebody to set him up with as long as she was short. Alan was not a tall man. Thankfully, Margaret fit the bill. On the appointed evening, Margaret and the other couple went to the restaurant in New York where Alan would eventually meet them. He was driving down from Boston. But a surprise snowstorm hit, and Alan had to pull off the highway in Connecticut. He phoned them to suggest another time. But Eric said, "Oh no, you've got to keep coming. We've had some drinks, and I don't have enough money to pay for dinner." Alan persevered, and he saved the day, and he won Margaret's heart. They were married 6 months later. Margaret's family wasn't thrilled with her fiancé, however, in an early example of red state, blue state division. But she felt welcomed by his family. He was her rock, says Randall, their daughter. And he felt the same about her when he died as when he married her. They both shored each other up. They were happily married 63 years. Eventually, the couple settled in Stoneham, and Alan had a long, successful career at Lincoln Labs. Together, they had 4 children: Randall, Alan Scott, Anne, and Martha. To raise them upright, Alan and Margaret sought out a church together, eventually settling on this one in the 1960s. In a sense, Alan and Margaret are the parents of this current congregation because Alan served as president when the Unitarians in Melrose merged with the Universalists. Together, the 2 of them witnessed and aided in the birth of the Melrose Unitarian Universalist Church, and we owe them a great deal of gratitude. Margaret was always a very active member here. She chaired the worship committee during the 1990s at a moment when the minister, the Reverend Bob Jones, died suddenly. So that must have been a big job for her. And Margaret was also a key part of the Quilters and the ladies group. She served on the board and on at least one ministerial search committee. If you really want to know people, you have to come to church more than just on Sunday, Margaret told me once. You have to get involved in a lot of different ways. Church has to become a habit. In 1970, Margaret went back to work as a nurse at Lawrence Memorial Hospital and then at Blue Cross, and eventually at a weight loss clinic. In 1985, Alan was offered a rare opportunity to work for 2 years on an army base in the Marshall Islands, and the couple took it as an adventure. While Alan monitored test missiles as they crashed into the Pacific, Margaret took up the craft of Hawaiian quilting. While they were gone, Randall and John and 1-year-old Meredith moved into their big house in Stoneham to watch their 7 cats. When the parents returned 2 years later, the 4 of them decided to turn the house into a 2-family to make living together a permanent arrangement. But from April to October 1988, while contractors transformed the interior into a 2-family, Alan and Margaret and Randall and John lived on the lawn in 2 trailers. Did I mention that they had 2 kids by now? One of them was a tiny infant. Of that time, Randall says, "It is a measure of everyone's maturity that we were still friends before, during, and after that renovation." Margaret loved having 2 of her grandchildren living so close by. For every grandchild that was born, she made a special quilt. In the late 1980s, Margaret and 3 friends founded a group to help victims of domestic violence. After 5 years of laying the groundwork, the Second Step Incorporated opened its doors in Newton to women and children in need of transitional housing. When the 4 started, no one in the group wanted to be its treasurer, so Margaret stepped up. She did not consider herself clever or good with numbers, but she persevered. With some help from her son-in-law, John, Margaret learned how to set up the books and eventually to make online withdrawals from a $5 million HUD account so they could renovate and equip their new building. 30 years later, with thanks to Margaret and her 3 fellow founders, the Second Step is still going strong, still helping survivors to survive. Alan and Margaret let each other shine, recalls Randall. Margaret was not a confident person. She was incredibly anxious most of the time. But Alan would say to her, "Yes, you can." He would coach her and stand behind her. And also the church was a wonderfully supportive, appreciative audience. Over time, Margaret did everything one could do in the church. She showed the power of being a volunteer. Ever since 1987, Margaret has lived with Randall and John and their children, even in the very last few months of her life when they finally sold the big house and moved into Bay State co-housing in Malden. Randall says, "People have said to us, 'Aren't you heroes for taking care of your parents in their old age?' Hell no," I say. They took care of us when our kids were young. They helped us. This is just the wheel turning full circle. Alan and Margaret built a solid foundation for their strong family. Their 4 children brought them 7 grandchildren, of whom they were very proud. One of Margaret's prized possessions was a necklace that had 7 names spelled out in beads, one for each cherished grandchild. "Our parents gave us everything," says Randall. "Thanks to them, we've got good health and good fortune, and the emotional stability not to screw it all up. Some people face headwinds, gales blowing against them all the way. But some lucky others have tailwinds supporting them as they go. My parents were definitely tailwinds." And now I invite the family to share their remembrances. If you would go up one at a time to the lectern, we'd love to hear from you.
Good morning. I'm Alan Scott. I am the sole member of the Grometstein family who decided living in Massachusetts was not for me. So as I took my first job out of school in Washington, D.C., spent 3 years there, and then moved up to New York City because whether it was a good idea or not, I had an office romance with this person named Yvette, who I eventually married, and we settled in first in Brooklyn and then in New Jersey. Okay. She's wondering if people can hear me. Yes. Sure. Yes, yes. Okay, how's that? I think I had a special connection with my mother over something you would not have thought about. You've heard about her being a quilter. Before that, she was into knitting. She was into crocheting. I remember the times my wife and my son and I went up to Maine, and Alan and Margaret there, and we brought one of our dogs. And all the dog wanted to do was sleep on what Margaret was crocheting. So Margaret was very, very crafty all the time. The connection I had with my mother was over sports. Hard to see, and I doubt that anybody here would say Margaret was a sports fan, but sports had a place through her life. She was an armchair sports fan. I always remember coming home from grade school, and the TV would be on, and my mother would be there doing housework in the house, and she'd be watching the Red Sox. That's back when TV showed the Red Sox in the afternoon. Games were 2.5 hours. It was a nice interlude. And at one point in time, several years later, I said, well, why were you watching the Red Sox? Why weren't you watching soap operas? And she said, because it was on, and it was quiet, and I could see it without having to hear it. I could understand what's going on. And that was good. And as I grew up, I hope some of us remember this program called ABC's Wide World of Sports. That was Saturday afternoon, 4:30 to 6. And I watched it religiously. And she would come through, look at the TV, sometimes sit down and watch. And this is when I found out she liked car racing. She liked to watch the Daytona 500, the Indianapolis 500, all sorts of things. But her favorite was the Demolition Derby from Islip, Long Island. Would sit there and, oh my God, she's going to get hit, they're going to get hit. And she always talked about, wouldn't it be nice to go and see the Indianapolis 500 in person? So it's thinking of a little bucket list. And I moved down to New Jersey. When I would call in the every week, it would be sometimes we'd have Randall and John on the phone. Certainly always have Alan and Margaret. But then after Alan left us, she found golf, and golf was her solitude. And she loved watching golf on TV, especially when the senior tour came on and the Golf Channel. The Golf Channel was her TV savior. So many, many years, we would talk. 3 o'clock, Sunday afternoon, I'd be there. Randall and John would mention she carried the phone around with her to get my call at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and would turn to the same channel. Now, I live in New Jersey, so I can tell you it's CBS or NBC or ABC. I couldn't tell you what channel she had on her cable system. So had to learn all this stuff for me, something new. And we would talk about this, and that's what kept us going for all these years. And even in her later years, I would describe to her what's going on. And she was a Tiger Woods fan. She was an older fan of all the older golfers. And she'd say, well, what happened to them? And, I had to describe to her what Tiger was going through in his life. So that was our interesting connection, and it kept us bonded all the way through the end. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Anne. I'm the second daughter, third child. What? She's signaling to me. Second daughter, third child in the order of things. The only redhead, by the way. The one thing my brother didn't mention was my mother watched bowling for years. Okay. And the reason she was a secret sports fan was my father was not interested in sports. So my mother lived for 95 years. That's a long time. It was a wonderful life she had, from my perspective. As Reverend Suzanne said, her early years were difficult. Her father's death really did separate the biological family. They lived in different places. She once told me that after her father died, she and her siblings never all lived together again because they had to separate to different households. There were just too many of them for any one place to take them in. She didn't talk a lot about that, by the way, and she probably never even mentioned it till she was in her middle age. But it struck me that I didn't know that my mother, who provided us with a household of love and warmth and caring, as my sister said, had had her own difficult start. So she overcame it and gave us what she hadn't had. And we really did have a wonderful household. The one thing, we always had pets. And to me, that seemed absolutely natural. There were always cats, many, many cats. At one point, we had 17 because my parents had the idea that they were going to breed Siamese cats. Okay? Well, they didn't quite get one of the young males to the vet in time, and he got 2 others pregnant. So, anyway, we had lots of cats. They were all given away or they found new homes. I took one. Her name was Jasmine. She was a Blue Point, and she lived with me for years and years and years. But so cats were a constant. We didn't have dogs in those days. Those came later. But we had the the required guinea pigs, gerbils. Anybody else? Anything else? Turtles. Oh, yes. Yes. Any tropical fish? Yes, okay. Does anybody remember Woolworth's stores? Okay. We got turtles there. Again, I didn't know you could buy a turtle somewhere. And they were small. They're now, I don't think you can have them anymore. They're now endangered. Small turtles. And unfortunately, I was not a good turtle mother. Several of my turtles went to heaven early. But my mother was a good sport about all these animals. She would coordinate the feeding needs of all the animals. We went to the pet store. I remember going to the grocery store and asking for the outer lettuce leaves that we would feed to our guinea pigs. So she was creative, nonetheless. She had 4 children, animals. She made it all work. I didn't really appreciate this till I became a mother of my own and ran a household. She fed us every meal we needed. She may not have been the world's best cook, but she certainly did cook, and we ate well. As she grew older, we all started, as we were getting older, we started creating scrapbooks of her recipes. So my mother's spaghetti sauce became one. I still make it today. And we would ask her to write it down, because often we were frantically calling her from our new apartment saying, "Mom, what do you put in the meatloaf?" And so finally she started writing them down. They became Maggie's menus. And at one point she actually thought of trying to start a company where we would put together menus for people. She was I would call that an early adopter. Now everyone's using HelloFresh and things like that, but she was thinking just the menus. It never got off the ground, but it was a great idea. After her children grew up and started leaving the house, she did have new adventures. My husband and Nelson and I took my parents on several trips. We took them to London. We took my mother only to Italy. In fact, this is Italy. We stayed in a house, and that's a beautiful cabinet that was in one of the rooms. She went by herself without her husband, which, if you knew my mother, you may not have known, that was a difficult decision for her to make. My father didn't want to go to Italy. She went, had a wonderful time. She celebrated a birthday there. And when she got home, my father said, "Gee, I wish I'd gone with you." We loved having Grandma there. We had several generations with us. My daughter Sarah, who read the poem, and her cousin Meredith were studying in England at the time, abroad in college, and we met the girls in London, and then we all traveled on to Italy. And it was Sarah and Meredith who made their grandmother her birthday cake that day. My mother, as Reverend Suzanne mentioned, went back to work as a nurse. She had taken many years off to raise her children, but she went back to work. Nursing had changed drastically in the years she was not in the workforce. She went to a refresher course at Salem State College, so back to school as a 40-year-old woman, and struggled a bit. She didn't think of herself as clever or smart the way her husband was and her children. She thought her children were, but she didn't think of that of herself. But she made it through some of the courses and then decided she didn't need to get the Bachelor of Science in Nursing that everyone was getting in those days. So she did do hospital work, but then she went on to the insurance industry. She worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield reviewing claims. So I thought this was a brilliant transition when I looked at it later in life. You don't have to do what everybody else does, but you can still use your skills. She also worked for the weight loss clinic, helping people. She herself battled her weight all her life and had gone, and she was an avid Weight Watchers person and had lost 50 pounds one year. So she saw the reason to work for the weight loss clinic to help others. I think her crowning achievement in life is the second step. She and these 3 other women had this idea that there needed to be something beyond the emergency shelters for people fleeing domestic violence, because people often went back to their bad situations because there was no other place to go. So they had this idea, they worked at it in each other's houses and over meetings for years, and finally they found a spot where they could actually place the program, and she became the treasurer, learned how to use HUD money, which was a great boon. Their first program was in a former Catholic, it might have been a convent that was shut down. So they made use of that resource, fixed it up, and it became the program it was. I remember going to a fundraiser they had, and a young woman stood up at the podium and told her story. She was all of 22. She had already had 1 or 2 children. She had been in a very difficult marriage, but she gave Second Step the credit for helping her to leave that marriage and find a way on her own. I, at the time, was already older than 22 and had never experienced anything like that. And I knew how lucky I was at that moment that my family gave me what I had and the choices I had made, but I knew there were people in the world, and I've known since, who didn't have that luxury. But the Second Step has made a difference in those lives, and they're still going. And my mother helped start that. Oh, sorry, Chalice. My parents went to Kwajalein. They took an adventure. Their children were older. Their grandchildren hadn't quite started arriving yet, or they were just about to arrive. They went off for 2 years, like giddy students again, and lived in this tropical island. My mother described it as summer camp, and had a great time. And that was officially the start of her retirement. When she got back, she didn't go back to work, and that's where she picked up quilting. And if you know my mother, you know she quilted all day, every day. And she did almost nothing, well, not nothing but quilting, but she was an avid quilter the remainder of her days until she either couldn't see the thread or her hands were giving her difficulties. She lived with one of her children and that family, and they did a great job of negotiating that. And if you've ever lived close with people you love, you know that there's negotiation involved in everything. But they made it work. They made it work. I was jealous because Grandma had those grandchildren, but she was a wonderful grandchildren to my children as well, and my younger sister's children, and the remote grandchild in New Jersey. Life post Al, after his death, was not easy for her. It often isn't. She made it through. She didn't enjoy life nearly as much after he was gone, but she was still herself. And she was here in this congregation for so many years, and I want to thank you all for loving my mother as you did, and for making a home for her, and helping her to make this a home for herself all those years. And it was a home for us, me vicariously. I grew up in this congregation. I'm no longer actively attending church, but that's a whole nother story. But it still is a large part of my life, and I want to thank you all.
I'm Randall. I'm the bossy oldest daughter. Oh, microphone, okay. Okay. Fair enough. I just want to thank you all for coming today. I want to share some similar memories. Obviously, it's one life we're talking about. I was about 9.5 when my youngest sister, Martha, was born. Martha is attending by Zoom today. My mother welcomed my help with the new baby. I was so proud. I never played with dolls after Martha was born because I got to take care of a real baby. And Martha, I was reminding her the other night of this story that I was changing her diapers and she actually rolled off the counter that I was using. And fortunately, she was fine. She laughs about it today. But I'm sure that my mother had reasons for wanting to trust me, but I didn't know that at 9. I was very, very proud. In the 1960s, my mother joined the Stoneham League of Women Voters and almost immediately became the newsletter editor. I think she may have had a problem with saying no. And many times she enlisted my help in putting out the newsletter, which was printed on a mimeograph machine. Anybody remember mimeograph machines? With the you had to turn the lever and there was a stencil and this god-awful purple ink. Your hands ended up completely purple. Then we would carefully dry them and fold them up and mail them. Looking back on it, I applaud her willingness to deal with new technology. Also in the early 1960s, while we were attending the Stoneham Unitarian Church, she was teaching Sunday school. And as a result, she took me to Star Island with her for RE Week, which was Religious Education Week for people who had said, okay, I'll teach Sunday school. And I fell in love with the Isles of Shoals. Anybody who knows me at all realizes I'm still in love with the Isles of Shoals. So as the oldest of 4, I was in high school and nearing graduation. So my mother decided she should go back to work to help pay for college, which in those days, Ivy League type schools were charging $2,400 a year in tuition, and my parents were worried. So she said, I will go back to work. But she was nervous. She'd been away from the job market for 17 years. So with much trepidation, she signed up for her refresher course, which I think was 6 weeks, 2 months, maybe. And on the morning, then she got a job at Lawrence Memorial Hospital in Medford. On the morning of her first day of work, she was so nervous that when she got out of bed, she stepped on her glasses and broke the bridge of the glasses. On her first day back at work with a pin that had her name and her RN, she wore a big wad of tape on her glasses, and probably that was what everyone talked to her about that day. What did you do to your glasses? So sometime, I think a little bit after that, while she was working at Lawrence, she decided she should enroll at Salem State to get her bachelor's. And as I wrote this, I thought, I didn't realize it went back that far. There was a Bachelor of Science in Nursing even then. So she started taking courses. The first time she had to write a paper for freshman English, she sat at our kitchen table, drawing a blank. Where to begin writing about Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman? She told me it was probably a mistake to have enrolled in the course. So I talked her off the ledge and started asking her questions about the play. Pretty soon, she had an outline, and then she was able to write her paper. Afterward, she asked me how I had known what to do. Good heavens, Mom, I said, I'm a junior in college and you're only a freshman. She looked startled and then laughed. As it turns out, she didn't finish her degree, probably a lot of reasons why, one of which was organic chemistry. But she told me that she would like to finish her degree in history. And people today are questioning the value of the humanities. After 5 years of hospital nursing, Margaret turned to a series of office jobs, as Anne mentioned, beginning with Blue Cross and continuing for about 10 more years. By 1985, all 4 children were successfully educated, and she could take an early retirement to go with Alan to the Pacific. She did indeed describe life on a remote Army base. They were 10 hours by plane from Honolulu. All right, pretty remote. She said that kind of environment she described as adult summer camp. When she came home, she just needed something to keep her busy, which is in part why she threw her energies into the second step, those energies that were not being consumed by quilting. And it was about at the same time that John had made the bright, my father wanted to sell the big old house on Franklin Street. There were just the 2 of them in the big old house. And that was my mother. My mother wanted to sell it. She said she didn't want to clean it. My father said, basically, over my dead body. And so John, ever the helpful one, said, why don't you turn it into a 2-family and rent out half of it? Well, they went away and thought about it, and then they said, why don't you guys buy half of the house so we don't have to be landlords? So the house, now they had, well, anyway, so we bought half the house from them and converted it to a 2-family. That was our first construction project. And a new chapter in our lives opened, not just for her and my father, but for John and me and the children, that has lasted nearly 40 years. So perhaps you've picked up on a theme here. I've been fortunate that Margaret treated me like a peer much of my life. And this was even more evident after John and I had bought half of the house. Both she and my father treated us like adults from day one, and as if we counted, as if our voices counted as much as theirs. And that's been very important to us. It was a partnership among all of us. I think another theme of her life is that she kept trying new things. As Anne has said, she didn't have the greatest self-confidence in the world. I think in some ways, the 9-year-old child whose father, he was healthy, he was 40 years old and he died of pneumonia. And this was about 10 years before they invented penicillin. And the 9-year-old child whose life has just turned upside down stayed with her almost to the very end. So she didn't trust herself or the world around her, but she kept trying new things. A third theme is that she cared about others, despite the fact that maybe in some cases she simply didn't want to let anyone down, but her life was a life of service. One day, a few months back, we talked about the finality of death. Thank you. I told her what the Reverend Phyllis O'Connell had once told me, that the light of a candle continues to spread outward even after the flame itself is extinguished. She liked that idea. Over the years, she mentioned wanting to design her memorial service, although somehow we never got around to that. She was too modest to think about what people would say about her. So it's a good thing that she can't hear us now. The death of her father gave her a lot to recover from, although she did, I think. Recover she did. And it seems to me she described herself as coming from German peasant stock. And she came a long way, reminding me of these words from a folk song by Susan Werner called May I Suggest. There is a hope that's been expressed in you. It's the hope of 7 generations, maybe more. And this is the faith that they invest in you. It's that you'll do one better than was done before. Margaret, you've done great. May your light shine on.
So Reverend Suzanne is learning an important lesson. Never ask a Grometstein to speak shortly. All right. Okay. I'm John Postel. Thank you all so much for coming. We're so grateful. I had several things I was going to say myself, but people have kind of taken them. That one. No, I don't need to do that one. You're not going to hear this one. I just want to say briefly that that I too was so grateful that they treated us so well when we joined in, and they're living in their home as a 2-family. But one of the things, everybody's talked about how wonderful she is and everything else, but so I want to mention she knew how to get her way. All right. You know, those of us who knew her, you know, Ellen seemed to lead the pack and that sort of thing, but when she really wanted something, she would make it happen. So I'm not going to go any further. I just want to say that she was wonderful, and I loved her, and she treated me like a son and like a friend and like a peer. And I think she did that with so many people, and I just miss her.
So I'm Sarah, I'm Anne's daughter. I'm the second oldest grandchild. And I knit, I crochet, I have started to quilt. I do not have the ability to finish projects that Grandma did, but I'm working on learning that as well. And I actually had 3 grandmothers, and Grandma was the last one standing, so now I don't have any more grandmothers. I really recommend collecting as many as you can. They're all wonderful. And I remember very distinctly being guided as a child and really being allowed to like whatever I wanted to like. And if it was something that Grandpa thought was amazing, I needed to go like it with him. And if it's something that Grandma thought was amazing, I would go like it with her. And that's how they split up their duties. Very good job. But as I got older, I really felt Grandma's quiet support. I love my grandfather dearly. He was very opinionated, as I'm sure you're all aware. And Grandma was very opinionated too, but I could voice things to her and she would say, well, I don't see it that way. But then would ask me questions about why I thought what I did, which now I get to do to other people, And one thing I really enjoyed was her ability to bring people into the family. So I actually met my partner, now of 10 years. We reconnected when Grandpa died. And Grandpa was a mathematician. He did write a nice little tome about general relativity, which is actually a delight. I read it with my partner, who has a PhD in physics, to sort of mourn Grandpa's passing. And it is, I don't know, 50% physics, 50% my childhood and my parents' generation childhood. Like, you hear some real funny cat stories, is all I'm going to say. And then also quirks. But Grandpa had gotten halfway through writing a sequel, and since Colin has a PhD in physics, the family was like, do you want to see if you can do something with this? And he was like, sure. So he was attempting to go through Grandpa's organization, AKA not labeling anything except with random letters. And Grandma and I were in the kitchen. And, you know, I told Grandma that I do absolutely love the story of their meeting because I am 5 feet tall, so it's objectively Grandpa's fault I am this short due to his demands about meeting Grandma. And she was like, well, do you know why I ended up marrying your grandfather? And I was like, tell me. She said, well, obviously I talked with other men, you know. And I was like, yeah, I've seen your pictures. Gorgeous. And she said, yeah, but none of them listened to me every time I talked. He listened to what I had to say when I was with my friends eating dinner. He listened to what I had to say in the wine bar afterwards. He listened to what I had to say when we were alone. And I was like, all right. Very good. Excellent choices. And she looks at me, and she looks over to the door that goes to where my partner is doing the thing significantly, and she says, Sarah, don't marry anyone who does not listen to you 100% of the time. I promised her. But she was always not usually that direct with her advice, but she had very good observations, and honestly, watching her still continue to struggle with some of her hurts as a child helped me move towards dealing with my hurts that I had had as a child. And now I am a social worker with a private practice who works with hurt kids all the time. So I hope I'm doing her legacy proud.
Thank you, family. I did promise that there would be a time where friends would be allowed to come forward and share. I know at least one person wants to talk about Margaret as a member of this congregation. And if there are others, I invite you to come forward. We'll share at this mic as we do from Joys and Sorrows. And if people wanted to maybe create a little line, things would go a little bit quicker. Right there, Michael, you passed that mic there. Nope, he says nope. I'm doing what I want. It's all good.
I tried.
If you could start with your name, because not everyone knows you.
For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Michael O'Connor, and I have some things to say about Margaret. When John and Randall asked me to speak at today's service, I accepted without even giving it a second thought. And then later, when I really had time to think about it, I panicked and said to myself, what in the world am I going to say? So I decided to just tell you a few little stories about Margaret and me and our relationship. Margaret was a wife, a mother, grandmother, sister, nurse, quilter, all of which you've heard, and had many other life roles. She was a long-term member of this church and did so much to nurture it and our members. It was Margaret and Alan, along with Joe and Don Gould, Jean and Phil Pendleton, Alice Heald, who reached out and welcomed Nancy and me to this church community. They grabbed our arms and marched us into Parish Hall after one of the Sunday services as we were trying to duck out the front door. Talk about radical inclusion. And it was Margaret who invited us to sit with her and Alan at the first church auction that we ever attended. Over the years, Margaret became a friend. As many of you know, I can become somewhat enthusiastic when trying to make a point that I'm passionate about. I will never forget the times when I was ramping up my enthusiasm. Margaret would so gently say, "Now, Michael," and stop me in my tracks. To this day, I can hear her with that "Now, Michael." So, Margaret, I want you to know this is not going to be one of those moments. We became even closer while serving together on the Ministerial Search Committee. Margaret truly enjoyed her experience, and she provided us with a historical perspective that was immeasurably helpful. She kept us focused on what was important. She told me on several occasions how much she enjoyed the work and the relationships that she built with each member of the committee. I was struck by her commitment and her work ethic. She never missed a meeting and always completed her assignments. I came to appreciate that this was just Margaret at her best. She told me that during the search committee work that she had one up on Alan. I smiled and came to understand that this was not just a passing comment of hers, but part of her spirit. Several years later, Alan served on another search committee. She remarked to me, ever so quietly, that he finally caught up. Of course, she said that with a smile and a little glint in her eye. As John confirmed, she loved her novels. Once when Nancy and I took her to lunch, the conversation eventually got around to what we were reading. I told her that I was reading the Alex Cross series by James Patterson. She nodded her head and told me that I should start reading Stone Barrington series by Stuart Woods. She said that she and Alan were reading these books and they found them very interesting. Who was I to ignore her? But let me tell you, she opened up a whole new perspective on Margaret. Briefly, Stone, as she and I referred to him as like he was part of the family, is a former New York City police detective who becomes a lawyer. As the series progresses, by the way, there are 47 books. Number 48 is on hold at the library. He becomes a billionaire and leads a rather interesting life. He finds himself working on cases that a respectable law firm doesn't even want to come close to or be associated with. He even falls into a lot of female relationships, including at one point the female POTUS. That's the President of the United States. After reading 6 books in the series, I checked in with Margaret and told her I was a bit surprised at her book selection. She asked me where I was in the series, and then after I told her, she said with a very straight face and a sparkle in her eye, "Oh, wait till you see what happens next." She certainly had a playful, fun-loving side to her. Margaret was one of a kind. I will remember her for how she nurtured us in so many ways. I will miss her smile and love of life. I'll miss her laugh. I'll miss seeing her on Sunday morning. I'll miss her talking, and I'll miss her hear her saying, "Now, Michael." Simply, I'll miss my friend. Rest in peace, Margaret. Rest in peace, my friend.
Hello, I'm Kathy Kellier, a member of this congregation. And when John asked me to speak about Margaret and the quilters here, he thought the service was in danger of ending after half an hour. So perhaps he has not realized how the Grometsteins love to talk. Well, about 12, 13 years ago, when I was a fairly new member, and Margaret was a very accomplished quilter. She made a splendid raffle quilt every year for the Harvest Fair, and she created the hands quilt that hangs out in the, what's it called, Parish Hall, yes. And so I wanted to do something for the veterans coming back from the Iraq wars. This was during the Bush administration. And I asked Margaret to help me start a group of quilters to make quilts for the veterans, lap quilts for people in wheelchairs. And she agreed. And we started with a few people. Now we're around a dozen. And we've made quilts for the veterans, but also children in hospitals and babies in the isolates at Melrose Wakefield Hospital. And I remember the year that we made a Hawaiian quilt with each of us hand sewing down the applique of an ornate flower pattern. It was splendid. And I love to think that all the quilts that have gone out into the world, bringing beauty, love, comfort.
My name is Muncie McLeod. I'm a member of this congregation, but I actually knew Margaret before becoming a member of the congregation. In the late 80s, I was working at a company where Margaret's daughter Anne was also working, and I was reading a book, The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, and Anne saw me there and said, "My family is reading that. Would you like to come to a discussion group?" And I said, "Sure." And it was a lovely, lovely time because in my family, my father's opinion was, I don't know, fact, law, at least until he changed it. And this was a place where people of different ages, respected, everybody had an opportunity to talk and was welcome. And it just felt very good, very good. So I think I attended a couple times. It was a very, very good book and very good company. And then around that time, I'd started going to massage school. I wanted to get out of high tech for a bit. And in my second year of massage school, they allowed us to work on clients for free. And I mentioned this to people at work, hey, anybody want that? And Ann again said, I think I have some folks for you. And Margaret was one of my first massage clients. And she came many times. And it was just really a pleasure to have that time with her in that way. And she got me started very well on a career that eventually didn't pan out. There's not a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time, and it's very difficult to support a family. But I did, and I also moved over to the West Coast, so I couldn't keep a practice here. But eventually I did come back with my family, and we settled in Melrose, and we were looking for a church. I'd had some experience with UU churches. This was a natural place to come. I knew nothing about it. I had a hint that I knew some people here because one of my massage teachers lived in Melrose and belonged to the church. But when I came in the door after the first service, and there were Margaret and Alan. What a wonderful surprise. And for me, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that she was one of the people who pointed me to the folks on the welcoming congregation at the time. And the rest is history. So Margaret was a wonderful person, a wonderful client, a wonderful friend. I'm glad I got to see her last fall. And she could always surprise you. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Steve Pastel, John's brother. And for all of you that did the double take, I'm his twin. I grew up in this church. Last time I stood in this vicinity, I was in high school. And as I thought about, did I want to say anything or not, I was debating, and I realized that what I remembered about Margaret first was her smile. That when I thought about her, all I could think about was a smile. And that actually consumed me most of the day yesterday. I was just sitting there thinking a smile. So I'll get up and I'll say a short thing. But Pastels would like to challenge Grometsteins, and so I will stay for a moment or two longer. But you win. I just want you to know, you win. The next thing that I remembered about Margaret was that she was the nurturer. Again, all of this goes back to high school, because I actually got to know her more then than I did as my brother's mother-in-law, because we just didn't connect that often. But it was wonderful. Alan was always sharing and doing great things. He had the printing press in his basement, and he was just amazing. Margaret was the one that smiled and said, "How are you doing?" And she really wanted to know. And so I loved her heart for that. I loved that she was the one who really reached out and cared. Not that Alan didn't care, but we were different. But Margaret was great. Alan was great too. I don't mean to. But anyway, so those are the last thoughts. And then just as I was ready to sit down, and you started to share a massage, if you want to practice, I'm open. As you were sharing about the different groups and the way that she would welcome people, I remembered that they ran the Heretic Bible Study. For those of you who don't know, I'm the black sheep of the Unitarian background, and I'm part of the Jesus freaks going down to the water and all that other kind of stuff. And it was the best Bible study that I went to anywhere, was going to the Heretic Bible Study with Alan and Margaret and John and Randall, and I forget who else was there. There was quite a little bit. Yeah. But it was great fun to sit there and enjoy that time. And that was kind of openness, you know. How many
people sit down and say, well, we'll study the Bible. Given this background, I realized it's not so unusual in other places. But this was unusual, and they were great because they were wonderful, welcoming people. And will always have a place in my heart. But I find it intriguing. The very first thing I thought of was the smile. And it took a very long time to get past the smile to remember all the wonderful ways that she touched my heart.
Thank you, Steve. I feel that I have to add just a few tiny words from Phyllis Blacklock. She couldn't be here today, but she wanted to say that she and her husband Robert knew Margaret for more than 50 years. She said that Margaret was the epitome of an empathetic person, always a good listener, and her special wisdom was legendary. Phyllis wanted to say, Margaret, we love you, and may you rest in peace. Thank you all for your sharing today. It paints a beautiful portrait of a long and rich and wonderful life. Now we'll have some time to reflect on all this as we enjoy some special music from our choir. This piece was chosen especially by Randall and John. It was written by a UU minister based on the writings of the 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich, which are the earliest surviving writings in English by a woman. This is All Will Be Well by Meg Barnhouse. We have been remembering with joy, gratitude, and sorrow our beloved Margaret. To summarize a life is an awesome task. Harder still to say goodbye and to begin to let go. Join with me, please, in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of life and love, mystery of the universe, under the vast spiral of time and space, surrounded by the simple blessings of a community of care and love, we offer these memories of Margaret, and we vow to cherish them always and carry them with us back to the community and the family that she loved. May we, as we go forth today, back to our lives and our work, reflect upon this life well lived, upon Margaret's good and true qualities. May we keep her memory alive by living as she did, steadfast in faith, constant in community, and loving toward family and friends. Spirit of life, remind us to love life as fully as we are able. Remind us to treasure our friends and families as Margaret treasured hers. And even though we must bid her farewell, the gift of her life is a treasure that cannot be ungiven. We celebrate today that Margaret lived among us and that her soul is now at rest. Amen. Please rise in body and spirit, and join please in our closing hymn. It's one that Margaret would have recognized from her childhood. It's number 273 in the gray hymnal, Immortal, Invisible, God Only Wise, on the organ, as Margaret would have liked. Lyrics will appear here on the screen. If you would please remain standing for the benediction. Those who live nobly, wrote Bertrand Russell, if in their day obscurely, need not fear that they lived in vain. Something radiates from their lives, some light that shows the way. The individual, if she is filled with love, with courage, and with endurance, can do a great deal. Margaret Grometstein, We love you, we honor you, and we bid you farewell. Amen. There will now be a postlude. The family will gather in the parlor, and after the postlude, you're invited to send them, go and greet them, shake their hand, a word of condolence, after which we'll join in Parish Hall for a lovely reception. Thank you.